Hey friends, so we're actually on part 3 of essay number 142. This essay about Columbus is really long, so I thought it was a good idea to kind of chunk it up a little bit and just kind of get through this beautiful essay with a little time, a little grace. You know, this book was published in 1865, so I think taking a little time with this long and detailed story might help us. Maybe we can learn a little something that we forgot. Fascinating ancient history, but that was right there. That was just the engraving that kind of goes along with our essay. It's entitled "Christopher Columbus Taking Possession of the New World." So let's go ahead and continue reading about how Columbus is taking possession of the New World here. Apparently it's, easy enough, according to that picture. Let's see. Okay, so they were in constant expectation of finding gold or reaching the court of the Grand Khan. He sent messengers, that is Columbus, he sent messengers into the interior, but they returned without discovering gold or spice or any trace of the great monarch. They, however, noticed the potato, and soon after were astonished by observing the natives rolling up the tobacco in a leaf, setting it on fire, and inhaling the smoke. Thus early were these two most important gifts of the new to the old world, noticed by its discoverers. All right, so picking up on page 352, guys. It's going to be a read. It's all right. For posterity. All right. From Cuba, Columbus ran eastward in search of a large island, which the Indians seemed to indicate as existing in that quarter. Adverse winds delayed the voyage, during which Pinzon deserted him, his vessel being the best sailor, and set out in search of some region of vast wealth, to which one of the natives offered to guide him. On the 5th of December, Columbus descried land in the southeast, with high mountains rising from rich plains and covered in lofty forests. This was the beautiful island of Hispaniola, as the Spaniards named it, from the similarity to the finest parts of their native land, or Haiti, as it is now called. Many natives were seen at a distance, but all fled to the mountains on the Spaniards' landing. At length communication with them was established, when they found a fairer and handsomer race than in the previous islands, but no less mild and hospitable, and ready to propitiate their heavenly guests with their simple gifts. Columbus sailed along the coast in constant admiration of the beauty of the country and the mildness of the sky. On the 24th of December, Columbus set sail to visit a cacique who had sent him some presents. The light winds prolonged the voyage, and in the evening the admiral retired to rest, supposing there was no danger. But no sooner had he left the dock than the steersman gave the helm in charge to a boy, and with his comrades of the watch lay down to sleep. The ship was borne aside by the currents and struck on a bank over which the waves were breaking with much fury. Columbus was first on deck and ordered the master and sailors to carry out anchor to warp the vessel off. But instead of obeying, they rowed away to the other caravel, leaving their commander in imminent peril. Here they were reproached for their desertion of their vessel, and forced to return with another boat, but too late to save the ship, which was carried more and more among the breakers. The crew took refuge in the other vessel, and next day, with the assistance of the Indians, landed all their goods. The conduct of the natives was admirable in the extreme, for nothing was missing among treasures, in their opinion, of inestimable value. The cacique visited the admiral and endeavored to console him for his misfortune, and a trade was established with the natives, who freely bartered gold dust for hawks' bells and other trifles. Many of the sailors, charmed with the idle life of the natives, entreated to be allowed to remain on the island, and Columbus, willing to lay the foundations of a new colony, complied. He erected a fort from the wreck of the caravel, receiving eager assistance from the natives, little dreaming of the yoke they were preparing for themselves. The cacique continued to load Columbus with gifts, especially gold, having soon discovered the high estimation which was entertained for this metal. In 10 days, the fortress named La Navidad, or the Nativity, in memorial of their shipwreck on Christmas Day, was completed, and 39 men chosen to remain. Columbus charged them to maintain friendly relations with the natives, to keep united in large parties, and to endeavor to obtain a knowledge of the mines which he had heard existed on the island. On the 2nd of February, 1493, he paid a farewell visit to the cacique and exhibited a mock fight among his crew to impress the natives with a due sense of their prowess. The thunder of the artillery and the destruction which the stone balls produced in the forest struck them mute with awe and admiration. On the 4th of January, Columbus sailed on his return to Spain, and in a few days met the Pinta, whose commander endeavored to excuse his desertion as involuntary. The admiral listened with silent incredulity, not wishing to give rise to any altercation. Pinzon had been for some time in Hispaniola, where he had collected much gold, and shared it with his crew to ensure their silence. They now sailed along the coast, where fresh proofs of Pinzon's duplicity appeared, which the admiral wisely left unnoticed. Some days after, they reached the Gulf of Semana, whose shores were inhabited by a bolder and more warlike race. In a quarrel, several of them were slain, the first bloodshed by Europeans in the Western world. But Columbus gained the friendship of the chief. Some of the Indians offered to guide him to a large island inhabited by the Caribs, and he set sail for it, but a favorable wind from the west having sprung up, he bore away direct for Spain, dreading the mutinous temper of his crew and anxious to secure the discoveries he had already made. The favorable wind soon died away, and they experienced much opposition from the trades, till they got so far north as to be beyond the region where they prevail. The pilots had lost all knowledge of the ship's course, and thought themselves much nearer to Spain than they truly were. Columbus did not undeceive them, though aware of their real position. On the 13th of February, they were involved in a hurricane which continued with great fury for several days. They now separated in the night from the Pinta, and lots were cast to decide which of the crew should go on pilgrimages if their lives were saved. 2 of these falling on the admiral. To secure at least a chance of preservation to his discoveries, he wrote an account on parchment which he enclosed in a wax cloth addressed to the king, with a promise of a reward of 1,000 ducats should it be delivered unopened. He then placed it in the center of a cake of wax, and enclosing the whole in a large barrel, committed it to the sea. On the 15th, land was descried, but 2 days elapsed before they could reach it. When it proved, as Columbus had affirmed, one of the Azores, named St. Mary's, belonging to the Portuguese. Columbus sent some of his men on shore, who brought back a friendly message from the governor. Next day, however, when half the crew went on shore to perform a vow made during the storm, I wonder what that was, the Portuguese detained them, and another storm arising, the admiral had to put out to sea in great danger with his crazy half-manned bark. He returned in 2 days, when his men were restored, and informed him that the governor had acted by orders from the King of Portugal, who had charged all the governors of distant islands and ports to seize and detain him. Columbus, having taken in wood and water, set sail for Spain. But new storms arose, which shattered his vessels so much that, notwithstanding his well-founded dread of the Portuguese, Columbus was glad to run into the Tagus, where he anchored on the 4th of March. He sent off a messenger to the King of Spain with the news of his arrival, and another to the court of Portugal, requesting liberty to take his vessel up to Lisbon. In this city, the account of his discoveries excited an extraordinary sensation, and Columbus was soon after invited to the court. This he would willingly have declined, but the tempestuous weather would not allow him to put out to sea, and he was obliged to comply. He was received with much magnificence, but the king was evidently greatly mortified by the thought that this splendid enterprise had been formerly refused when offered to himself. He consulted his counselors on the subject, some of whom even suggested that Columbus be assassinated, as trying to embroil the two nations by pretended discoveries. But the king had sufficient honor to reject this expedient, while he resolved to fit out a private armament and take possession of the new country. Columbus was allowed to depart, and reaching Palos on the 15th of March, which place he had left on the 3rd of August the previous year. It has often been remarked that he encountered half the difficulties and storms on his outward voyage which assailed him on his return. He would inevitably have been compelled to desist, and this great discovery may have been deferred to an indefinite period. At Palos, Columbus was received with shouts of joy, and his passage along the streets resembled a triumphal procession. The same evening, Pinzon, who had also escaped the tempest and touched the port of Bayonne, where he had sent a letter to the court with news of his discovery, also entered the harbor. When he heard of the enthusiastic reception of Columbus, his heart sunk within him. All his treachery and evil conduct rose before him, and dreading to meet his injured commander, he repaired privately to his dwelling, downcast and broken in health. A severe and reproachful reply to his letter to the king increased his dejection, and in a few days after he died of envy and remorse. As Washington Irving beautifully observes, his story shows how one lapse from duty may counterbalance the merits of 1,000 services, how one moment of weakness may mar the beauty of a whole life of virtue, and how important a matter it is for a man, under all circumstances, to be true not merely to others, but to himself. There you go. I guess you can up and die of envy and remorse. The Spanish court was now at Barcelona, and Columbus, while waiting orders, repaired to Seville. Here he received a letter requesting his immediate presence at court and desiring him to make arrangements for a second voyage, as the summer was now at hand. Having complied as far as possible with the latter request, he set out for the court, taking with him 6 Indians and several curiosities he had brought home. His road was crowded with joyful and wondering multitudes, and he entered Barcelona in a procession that has been compared to a Roman triumph. He was received by the king and queen in great state, and when he knelt down, they raised him up and ordered him to sit in their presence, a mark of rare honor in that ceremonious court. He was then requested to give an account of his voyage, at the conclusion of which the whole assembly sank on their knees, giving thanks to God for the discovery of a new world, and the anthem Te Deum was sung. Columbus was, for the moment, the object of universal curiosity, applause, and admiration. Nor was this feeling confined to Spain, but responded to with general exultation over the whole civilized world of Europe. As yet, the sudden splendor of his discovery overpowered all feelings save those of joy and exultation. The Spanish sovereigns took every measure fitted to secure possession of their new discoveries. An envoy was sent to the Pope, who granted a bull ceding to them all the rights, privileges, and indulgences which had formerly been accorded to the Portuguese in their African discoveries, on the same condition of planting and propagating the Catholic faith. Another bull was issued on the following day, containing the famous line of demarcation between the territories of the rival monarchs, from a line from pole to pole, passing 100 leagues west of the Azores. This has been frequently quoted as proof of His Holiness's ignorance of the true form of the earth, but perhaps only shows that he did not anticipate the possibility of the circumnavigation of the globe. The negotiations with the court of Portugal were more difficult and tedious, each of the princes endeavoring to deceive and outwit his rival. After repeated embassies, the matter was, however, arranged on the 7th June, 1494, the papal lines of partition being moved 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands, and the territory on the west assigned to Spain, that on the east to Portugal. Meantime, Columbus was hurrying on his second expedition, afraid that the Portuguese should anticipate him by a secret attempt. To aid him, a board was appointed under Juan de Fonseca, Archdeacon of Seville, and afterwards Patriarch of the Indies. Fonseca is represented as a worldly man of a vindictive disposition, to gratify which he did not hesitate to sacrifice the interests of his master. He soon conceived a most rancorous hostility to Columbus, which occasioned him many vexations and delays, and proved highly injurious to the interests of their common master. A fleet of 17 vessels was soon ready at Seville, containing many skillful mechanics and miners, and loaded with horses, domestic cattle, grains, sugar canes, and other plants. The number of persons had been limited to 1,000, but such was the eagerness of volunteers that 1,500 eventually sailed, eager to engage in the new field of adventures and reap a portion of its golden fruits. All the titles and privileges promised to Columbus were confirmed, and his powers in the New World even extended. Under such altered circumstances did the admiral leave Cadiz on the 25th of September on his second voyage to the Indies, his companions no longer forced on board like condemned criminals devoted to sure destruction, but glad and rejoicing in their good fortune in being permitted to join in this glorious enterprise. On the 5th of October, the fleet anchored at Gomera, one of the Canaries, and increased their livestock by various purchases, among which Las Casas mentioned 8 hogs, the fertile parents of the innumerable multitude of swine dispersed through the Spanish colonies. After being becalmed for some days among the Canaries, Columbus kept further south, and thus out of the region of seaweeds, which had so much encouraged his sailors on their former voyage. The trade winds again bore them greatly along till the end of October, when they were awestruck by one of the tremendous thunderstorms common in the tropics. The electrical fluid, adhering with lambent flames to the top of the masts, revived their spirits, as the sailors, according to an old superstition, thought it was Saint Elmo with 7 lighted tapers, a sure proof that no danger would befall them. On the 2nd of November, Columbus thought he saw signs of land, but early next morning a lofty island appeared, to which he gave the name of Dominica, as it was discovered on a Sunday. This event was celebrated by loud anthems of praise and thanks to God for guiding them in safety over the mighty ocean. Columbus had reached the Antilles, a beautiful group of small islands shutting in the Caribbean Sea. After touching on one island, which was uninhabited, they landed on another, named Guadalupe, with a lofty mountain from which streams of water broken into white foam descended. The natives had all fled, but their tents contained articles of earthenware, bows and arrows, plenty of provisions, domesticated geese, and beautiful parrots. Numerous human bones and skulls, apparently used as vases, filled the Spaniards with horror, and some women who they took captive on the following day informed them that the natives, whom they named Caribs, were in the habit of killing and eating their prisoners. The captain of one of the ships, with 8 men, had lost themselves in the woods, and Columbus entertained great apprehensions that they had fallen victims to the savages. Fortunately, however, the Carib warriors were all absent on some predatory expedition, and the stragglers returned just when the fleet was about to sail without them. Columbus proceeded to the northwest, being anxious to learn the fate of the colony left at Hispaniola, passing many islands on his way. At Santa Cruz, a boat was sent on shore for water, and on its return intercepted a canoe with a few Indians who came suddenly round a point of land between it and the ship. After a desperate resistance in which one of the Indians was killed and their canoe destroyed, and the others were captured and brought on board the ship, where their fierce, untamed demeanor, so unlike the manners of the natives of Hispaniola, struck the Spaniards with astonishment. They passed many other islands, among them Puerto Rico, where they landed, but saw none of the natives, who were always at war with the Caribs. Latter people said to have spread from the Appalachian Mountains over the whole chain of the West India Islands, and thence even to the mainland of Brazil, were the scourge of the more peaceable and unwarlike tribes. Though the reports of their cannibalism were probably false or greatly exaggerated. The Caribs were from the Appalachian Mountains. They just came down from the Appalachians down to the West Indies. Wow. On the 22nd of November, the fleet reached the eastern point of Hispaniola, and the admiral hoped soon to arrive at the fort where he had left his followers on the former voyage. On passing the Gulf of Samana, the scene of his former combat with the natives, a young Indian who had accompanied him to Spain was set on shore as a messenger of peace to his countrymen. No account was ever received of him afterwards, and he was not improbably sacrificed to their avarice or jealousy. On the evening of the 25th, the fleet reached La Navidad, but it was already too dark to approach the coast or discern the fort. 2 guns were fired as a signal to their comrades, but no answer was returned. No sign of life was to be seen on the coast. A canoe soon after appeared, and the Indians, on seeing Columbus, came on board. They told him that some of the Spaniards left in the fort had died of sickness, that others had been killed in quarrels among themselves, and the remainder had removed to another part of the island. Next day, none of the natives appeared, and on landing, a burned and blackened ruin alone marked where the fort had stood. Continuing their researches, they next discovered a grave containing 11 bodies, which proved to be those of Europeans. At last, some Indians were met with, from whom the fate of the garrison was ascertained. The Spaniards were hardly relieved from the authority of the admiral than they began to abuse the poor natives. Surprise. Robbing them of their property and seducing their wives and daughters. Seducing their wives and daughters? Is that what you want to call it? Seducing their wives and daughters. They quarreled among themselves, of course, disobeyed the orders of their commander, and dispersed themselves over the country. 11 of them set out for the dominions of Caonabo, a warlike chief of the Carib origin, who ruled over the gold mountains in the interior, where they expected to find immense wealth. They were seized immediately on entering his dominions and put to death, and Caonabo resolved to rid the island of the strangers. Didn't do it hard enough, I guess. Okay, he made a descent on the fort and, attacking it during the night, had full possession before the few men remaining in it were aware of their danger. The whole of the Spaniards were slain, and the village of the neighboring Indians who attempted to defend them burned to the ground. The history of this first European settlement is an epitome of many that have followed, of the base vices and lawless abuse of their superior power by men boasting of their civilization, of the fierce revenge of the savage, his momentary success, his final destruction. Every fucking time. The cacique, or chief of Indians, soon after sent a message excusing his absence and stating that he was confined to his tent by a wound received in defense of the Spaniards. Columbus visited him when he was related the misfortune of the garrison, with tears in his eyes, and convinced the admiral of his good faith, though some of his followers were of a different opinion. The cacique afterward visited the ships, where he was lost in astonishment amid the new and unknown objects that he beheld. The horses especially, their great size, their apparent fierceness, yet perfect docility, filled with amazement men who knew only the most diminutive quadrupeds. The females rescued from the Caribs were also a special object of attention. In particular, one distinguished by her lofty air and manner, with whom the cacique conversed repeatedly. After a repast, the chief begged permission to return on shore, perhaps feeling uneasy at the dark, suspicious looks of the Spaniards, some of whom advised Columbus to retain him prisoner. Next day, the brother of the chief came on board and conversed for some time with the women. He was probably concerting their escape. As in the night, they all slipped overboard, and, though heard and pursued, swam to the land 3 miles distant, and escaped. Next day, when Columbus sent on shore to reclaim them, he found the village deserted and the natives fled into the interior. Wish it was that easy. Columbus left this place, where there was now no inducement to remain, as the locality seemed unhealthy and unfit for a permanent settlement. When looking for a situation adapted for this purpose, he was driven by adverse weather into a harbor, and being pleased with its appearance and hearing that the mountains of Ciboa contained gold mines were at no great distance, he resolved to found a city named Isabella for his royal patroness. A plan was formed and preparations begun when a disease broke out among the Spaniards, already suffering from their long confinement on shipboard and unaccustomed to the climate of the tropics. Disappointment, too, increased their maladies when their golden dreams melted away and the necessity of hard labor appeared. Even Columbus suffered from exposure to the climate and the numerous anxieties in which he was involved. Still, though confined to his bed, continued to direct the affairs of the expedition and the building of the town. The ships had now discharged their cargoes, and were soon to return to Spain, but no merchandise was provided, and no treasure even ascertained to exist. The Golden Mountains, however, were at no great distance, and Don Alonso de Ojeda, one of the most adventurous of his followers, set out with a party to explore them. They found the natives friendly. The sands of the mountain streams glistened with particles of gold, and fragments weighing several ounces were collected. With these glad tidings he returned to the admiral, who now sent home 12 ships, retaining 5 for further discoveries. As yet, Columbus had only promises of wealth to give in return for the supplies he requested to be transmitted from Spain. Till articles of more value could be procured, Columbus proposed sending home Carib slaves in return for livestock. But Isabella refused her consent to this inhuman project. Though no wealth was brought back by the fleet, still the reports of the gold mines prevented that disappointment whose effects the admiral justly dreaded. On recovering from his illness, Columbus was about to set out to explore the interior when he discovered a plot among a portion of his followers to seize the ships and return to Spain, where they hoped to find forgiveness by accusing their chief of deception. The ringleaders were arrested, the chief, Bernal Diaz, confined in order to be sent to Spain for trial, and some others punished less severely than they deserved. This act of authority formed a new ground of offense and excited the national feelings of the Spaniards against the foreigner, as they regarded Columbus. On the 12th of March, however, he set out for the interior with about 400 men, leaving the command of the town and the fleet to his brother Diego, a man of an easy and facile disposition. On reaching the summit of the first range of mountains, the Spaniards were lost in admiration of the beautiful plain, which extended like an earthly paradise before them. Through this region, which he named the Vega Real, or Royal Plain, Columbus continued his march, being everywhere hospitably received by the Indians, when their first terror at this strange spectacle was overcome. On the second day he reached another chain of mountains, higher and more rugged, but as they were now in the golden region, Columbus, before penetrating further, resolved to erect a fort and commence to work the mines which he believed to exist. The fort, named St. Thomas, was built on an eminence protected by a small river. Here he left 56 men and set out on his return for the coast, halting some time, however, in the Indian villages along the way. He thus acquired more knowledge of the manners of the natives, some of whose customs and opinions are very curious. He at first regarded them as atheists, but soon found that, besides a belief in one supreme deity, they also had many inferior gods, some of the peculiar guardians of each tribe, others allotted to watch over every special department of nature. They also had priests or magicians, and some imperfect notion of the creation of the world and universal deluge. They believed that mankind originally came out of a certain cave, large men from a large hole and the small men from a small one, and they had no women among them at first, but at last found them among the branches of a forest near a small lake. The ladies were, however, as slippery as eels, so that the men could not for a long time catch any of them, till some whose hands were rough with a kind of leprosy succeeded in securing 4 of these slippery females. The natives appeared an idle, careless race. What do you expect from slippery females? The natives appeared an idle, careless race, living chiefly on the spontaneous produce of their woods and rivers. On reaching Isabella, Columbus found the sickness continuing, the stores of provisions almost consumed, and discontent and disappointment very prevalent. The last were greatly increased when he required the cavaliers to aid in erecting certain public works of immediate necessity. The proud hidalgos considering all labor as degrading. These circumstances greatly embarrassed Columbus. Yeah, I mean, seriously. Greatly embarrassed Columbus, who was desirous of proceeding on another voyage of discovery. He therefore sent all the persons who could be spared into the interior under the command of Pedro Margarite, with orders to explore the country. He gave strict orders to treat the Indians with kindness, justice, and caution, to respect their property and persons, except Caonabo, the Carib chief, whom they were to seize by stratagem. An incident that now occurred convinced him that there was little to fear from the natives. A horseman returning from the interior found 5 of his countrymen captive among a crowd of Indians. Though more than 400 in number, the sight of his horse put them all to flight. The sight of his horse put them all to flight, and he brought off his friends in triumph. Leaving his brother Diego governor in his absence, Columbus sailed in the 3 smallest vessels in search of new lands. He first proceeded west, and in 5 days came in sight of the east end of Cuba. He coasted along it for a short way, but learning from the natives that a country rich in gold was to be found in the south, he turned in that direction. The blue summits of Jamaica soon rose above the horizon, and on drawing near land they were met by a fleet of 70 canoes full of gaily painted savages, decorated with feathers and brandishing their wooden lances with loud yells. A few presents pacified this angry armada, but next day, when he entered a harbor to careen his ship, he found the whole beach covered with hostile Indians. Wishing to inspire them with terror, in order to prevent all future molestation, the admiral caused some boats to row close to shore. The Spaniards let fly a volley of arrows from their crossbows, and then springing to land, pursued the multitude. A fierce dog was then let loose on the Indians, the first instance of the employment of these animals against the natives. Subsequently, intercourse was established with the Indians, who were more warlike and ingenious than those of Haiti, and possessed larger canoes. These were hollowed from a single tree, and one of them measured 96 feet long by 8 broad. After a few days, Columbus, finding no signs of gold, returned to Cuba. Here he was involved among a vast multitude of small islands, which rendered navigation very dangerous and difficult. He, however, named them the Queen's Gardens, from the verdure with which they, as it were, covered the surface of the sea. He, however, named them the Queen's Gardens, from the verdure with which they, as it were, covered the surface of the sea. Some of these islands were inhabited, and Columbus was much amused by a method of the natives employed in fishing. They attached a long line to the tail of a small fish with a flat head furnished with numerous suckers. They allowed it to swim about, when it generally kept near the surface, but on perceiving a large fish, it would dart on it, and fixing itself firmly by its suckers, would retain its hold till both were drawn out of the water. I wonder if that was like a remora or something. That's kind of cool. Besides fish, the Spaniards saw large tortoises caught in this way, which it appears is also practiced on the east coast of Africa. Columbus continued his voyage along the southern shore of the island, which he believed to form part of the Asiatic continent. In this navigation, he encountered many difficulties from the numerous sandbanks and keys, or small islands. At last, being fully convinced that he had reached a continent, and fearing the exhaustion of his provisions and the shattered condition of his vessels, he determined to return. After getting free of the small islands, he cast anchor at the mouth of a river in order to refresh his men, harassed by their long voyage and anxieties. From this place he intended to return directly to Hispaniola, but was forced by contrary winds to the coast of Jamaica, along which he sailed, having frequent intercourse with the natives. Thence he reached the shores of Hispaniola, where he was soon recognized by some of the natives, among whom his fame was widely spread. After sailing along its southern side, he came to a region already explored, but intended to continue his researches further east among the Caribbean islands. The hardships, exertions, and anxieties of his 5 months' voyage had, however, exhausted his mental and bodily powers. He was struck with a sudden malady, which deprived him of memory, sight, and all his faculties. And the crew, alarmed at the deep lethargy of the admiral, abandoned all thought of prosecuting the voyage, and bore away direct for the harbor of Isabella. Here Columbus rejoiced to meet his brother Bartholomew, who had arrived from Spain with supplies, but found the affairs of the island fallen into the utmost confusion during his absence. Columbus, before departing on his voyage, had, as we mentioned, given the command of his troops to Marguerite, with orders to explore the island. Instead of obeying these orders, Marguerite quartered himself and his followers among the natives of the Vega, whom he oppressed and abused in all possible ways. Of course, to the remonstrances of the council and Diego Columbus, he paid no attention. But at last, fearing the investigation of his conduct on the return of the admiral, he resolved with his associates to seize some of the ships and return to Spain. He was joined in this scheme by Friar Boyle, to whom the religious superintendence of the colony had been committed. Deserting their posts, they had sailed for Spain, leaving the army without a head and without discipline. The men became bolder in their abuse of the natives, till the latter, roused to resentment, began to take secret vengeance on their oppressors. Scattered parties and individuals were put to death, and success in these attempts led to bolder undertakings. Caonabo resolved to attack the fortress, built without permission on his territories, and now garrisoned by only 50 men. They were commanded by Alonso de Ojeda, who to great natural bravery added his military skill acquired in the Moorish wars. Caonabo assembled 10,000 warriors, but found his adversary on his guard, and being unable to force so strong a fortress, endeavored to reduce it by famine. After 30 days' siege, in which many of the Indians perished, he was obliged to withdraw, but meditated an attack on the town, weakened by the dispersion of the troops and the sickness of those who remained. He made a league for this purpose with 3 other chiefs, but Guacanagari, the first friend of the Spaniards, whose dominance was nearest the town, remained faithful to them and delayed the attempt. He thus brought on himself the hostility of the Confederates, who plundered his country and killed many of his subjects. Columbus took varied measures to quiet the island, punishing some of the chiefs and gaining others by conciliatory treatment. From his most dangerous enemy, Caonabo, he was freed by a daring stratagem of Ojeda, who, with 10 horsemen, ventured into the camp of the chief on a pretended friendly mission. More deception. And having the false representations induced by the simple Indian to mount behind him, and suffer himself to be adorned with polished shackles, bore him off in triumph from his astonished warriors. This deceit, however contrary to our feelings, seems to have been viewed in a different light by its victim, who, when a captive, always showed the highest respect for Ojeda, while he proudly refused all marks of deference for Columbus, though well aware of his superior rank. Another important event for the colony was the arrival of Antonio Torres with 4 ships loaded with provisions and accompanied with many workmen and mechanics. The dispatches from court were still favorable, insidious enemies having not as yet poisoned the ear of princes against Columbus. The admiral hastened the return of Torres, sending with him his brother Diego to support his interests at court and to give his advice in settling the boundaries of their respective discoveries with Portugal. In the fleet was sent not only all the gold and other precious metals which he could procure, but also above 500 Indian prisoners, whom he recommended to be sold as slaves at Seville. Thus early was begun that accursed trade in human flesh, which has produced more misfortune to mankind than all the wars from that time to the present, and which is no less disgraceful to humanity than the cannibalism of the savages for which the Spaniards express such horror. One of Caonabo's brothers, attempting revenge on his captivity, had been defeated by Ojeda, but this did not prevent the other chiefs from collecting their forces for his rescue. Columbus, learning from the friendly Indians that they had assembled in Vega, marched out to meet them, though his whole army only amounted to 200 infantry, 20 horse, and the same number of bloodhounds, not the least dangerous opponents to the naked Indians. A battle, or rather massacre, took place in the Vega, the natives who had trusted to their numbers being at once dispersed by the fire of the infantry and then cut down by the cavalry or hunted like wild beasts by the savage dogs. Columbus followed up on his victory by subduing almost the whole island and imposing a tax of a certain quantity of gold dust, or, where this was not produced, of cotton, on each of the natives. The chiefs remonstrated against this grievous burden, but in vain. Their people, seeing no hope of relief, deserted their fields and retired to the mountains, hoping that famine might drive away their persecutors. But this only increased their severities, and after a large part of the Indians had perished by want and violence, the remainder returned to linger under the yoke of slavery. Even the friendly Guacanagari and his people were subjected to the same impositions and cruelties, till the chief, unable to endure the reproaches of his miserable subjects, retired to the mountains and died in poverty, a victim to the strangers whom his hospitality had more than once preserved from destruction. The malcontents who had returned to Spain were not wholly unsuccessful in prejudicing the sovereign against Columbus, who, as a foreigner, had no influence to support him at court. Even the arrival of Torres, with news of the discoveries made in the recent voyages and the specimens of gold which he brought, did not restore Columbus to his former favor. Juan Aguado was sent as a commissioner to investigate the affairs of the island, and though formerly highly indebted to Columbus, soon became his bitterest foe. On arriving at Isabella, he found the admiral absent in the interior, and immediately assumed high authority to himself, and interfered in all the public affairs. When the admiral returned to the interior, he received Aguado with all the courtesy due to his royal messenger, and when his inquiries were finished, intimated his intention of returning with him to Spain. Their departure was delayed by a tremendous hurricane which swept over the island with such awful fury that even the Indians thought it a divine judgment on the crimes and cruelties of the white men. It destroyed all the vessels in the harbor except one, left in a very shattered condition. While the vessels were repairing, Columbus received news of great importance. A Spaniard, Miguel Diaz, in the service of his brother Bartholomew, had wounded one of his comrades dangerously in a quarrel, and fearing the consequences, had fled to the south of the island. Here he had won the heart of a female cacique, and lived with her some time very happily. But at length he became desirous of returning to his friends, and fell into a deep melancholy. His Indian bride, learning the cause, and desirous of drawing the Spaniards to her part of the island, that he might not thus be induced to abandon her, informed him that there were rich mines in the neighborhood. Diaz, having ascertained the truth of the report, returned to his master, who easily reconciled to him and set out personally to investigate the mines. He found them as rich as was reported, and deep pits near them as if dug in former times, which gave rise to a curious conjecture of Columbus that he had now discovered the ancient Ophir of Solomon. The tidings were indeed highly grateful to the admiral, both as decisive proofs of the wealth of the island, thus silencing the cavils of his enemies, and as an excuse for removing the colony from its unhealthy situation. Diaz was pardoned and employed in various duties, all of which he discharged with fidelity. He also kept faith with his Indian spouse, who seems to have become a Christian and to have been baptized. On the 10th of March, 1496, Columbus sailed for Spain, along with Aguado. Keeping too far south within the trade winds, his passage was long and tedious, so that he had to touch at Guadalupe for provisions. The shores were only defended by the women, some of whom they took prisoners, but again set free before their departure. One heroine, however, refused her liberty, and chose rather to accompany Caonabo, whom Columbus was taking with him, to Spain. But the Carib chief was destined never to arrive there. His proud heart was broken by his misfortunes, and he died on the voyage. During this voyage, the Spaniards were reduced to great extremity, some even proposing to kill and eat their Indian prisoners. On the 11th of June, Columbus at last reached Cadiz after a weary passage of 3 months. His hopes and reception were very different from what they had been on his former return 3 years before, and the miserable, emaciated figures of his sickly companions and their yellow countenance, a mockery, says an old writer, of that gold they had gone to seek, was no unfit emblem of the public disappointment. He, however, received a friendly letter from the court, and on his arrival there met with a kindly reception, his great merits not being yet wholly forgotten. He proposed to undertake a new voyage of discovery, which was readily agreed to, but numerous delays were destined to intervene before its accomplishment. Affairs of more immediate necessity demanded all the care and resources of the king, while envious counselors insinuated to him the great cost and small profit of the boasted discoveries. At length, the influence of the Queen procured certain measures favorable to Columbus and adapted to promote the prosperity of the colony, but the management of the Indian affairs was committed to his cold-blooded enemy, Fonseca, who persecuted him and embarrassed his proceedings by the meanest and most despicable artifices. Absent, envied, and a stranger, as he said in a letter to the king, every one was against him, and it was only his gratitude to the Queen that induced him to persevere. At length, on the 30th of May, 1498, Columbus sailed with 6 vessels on his 3rd voyage to the New World. He proceeded south to the Cape Verde Islands. Thence he continued southwest till his ship was involved in the region of the calms near the equator. Here the wind fell, and a dead, sultry air, as from a furnace, hung over the ships, wasting their stores and destroying the health and spirits of the men. He then altered his course more to the west and reached land with his provisions nearly exhausted and only 1 cask of water remaining in each ship. It was the island of Trinidad, which Columbus named from a vow he made to consecrate the first land he should reach to the Trinity. He coasted along the southern shore of the island and was surprised at its fertility, at the coolness of the air, and the fair complexion of the natives, all so unlike the tropical character of Africa. He was now sailing in the strait between Trinidad and the mainland, on some parts of which he touched in the Gulf of Puria. the Gulf of Puria, but without knowing that it was in reality the continent he had so long sought. That's the Gulf of Paria. Sorry, it's hard to read. It really is. He was now sailing in the strait between Trinidad and the mainland, on some parts of which he touched in the Gulf of Paria, but without knowing it was in reality the continent he had so long sought. The strings of pearls worn by the natives highly interested him as a new source of wealth and a confirmation of his theories. His time, however, would not permit of further researches, so retracing his way, he sailed through the narrow passage between Trinidad and Cape Boto in Paria, where the sea was raging and foaming, the currents becoming swollen by the large mass of fresh water then poured into the Gulf. He passed through it, however, in safety, and examined part of the north coast of Paria, when he was compelled to sail for Hispaniola. He reached it considerably north of the point he wished, having been carried out of his reckoning by the strong currents. Sending a message on shore to his brother, he sailed for the river Ozema, and was soon met by his brother Bartholomew, who came off in a caravel to meet him. In a letter to the sovereign relating his voyage, Columbus enters into various speculations, some of them wild and fanciful in the extreme, concerning his new discoveries. He, however, rightly conjectured from the quantity of fresh water flowing into the Gulf that it must come from some continent of vast extent, which he still maintained to be part of Asia.